Hey, what's up, everybody? It's Yesko again from AcousticSinsider.com, and I'm joined again by Graham from Music City Acoustics. Hey, Graham, how's it going today?
Great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm excited to dive into part three of this series with you. For you guys watching, basically, what we did or what we are currently doing is walking you through the entire treatment from start to finish of the demo room of Music City Acoustics. And this is, as I mentioned, part three. In part one and two, we looked at positioning the setup, finding your listening position, positioning your speakers, and then going through the entire planning and install of the treatment. What we want to do in this video is give you the big reveal. We're going to look at the before and after measurements, see if we reached our goals, and then walk you through the process of what happened to the room as Graham went and installed all the treatment. There were some changes along the way. So basically, we identified that there were a couple of things that could be improved right on the spot. And so Graham did quite a few experiments to improve improve upon the original plan. But he's going to talk to you all about that. Before we jump into that, real quick, obviously with all these measurements, Room EQ Wizard measurements, if you want to follow along, I've got a Room EQ measurement checklist for you to download at the link in the description. This is a simple checklist to walk you through taking calibrated measurements so you can make apples to apples comparisons with before and after measurements, because sometimes it can be a bit tricky if you don't pay attention to taking those measurements properly. So that's the REW measurement checklist at the link in the description. But with that, Graham, let's get started, shall we?
Yeah, let's do it.
So I think we're all very curious and excited to see how this turned out. So do you want to pull up Room EQ Wizard for us and show us the before and after? Show us just how well the treatment actually worked in your room.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it.
So here we got the empty room. This is kind of where we left off with our measurements in the first video. So things were looking pretty good in terms of the empty room. Overall, considering there's nothing in here, pretty well balanced.
Yeah.
And so I'll jump over to our impulse response. And so we can see a lot of reflected energy looking at the Schroeder line up top here. Then obviously some of the more larger peaks in information that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of show all the trends here.
Yeah.
Quite the long decay time for the empty room.
Yeah.
So it was a very nice echo chamber when we started. Around 1.5 seconds or so. And if we take a look at the spectrogram, we'll see something pretty similar. So a ton of just reflected energy, long decay times across the frequency spectrum, pretty much from top to bottom. We can see some of the room modes kind of poking their heads out, having a bigger impact on things here. And so let me jump back to our frequency response, and then I'll show you the after measurements that we got. So overall, looking at the frequency response, and both of these have all the measurements in here right now have 1/12 octave smoothing on them.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm.
So definitely was able to smooth things out quite a bit here, make it more balanced. It's not flat by any means, as we can tell, but really all in all, has come into a really nice, well-balanced room, and pretty similar to kind of how we'd projected it out being, starting off from a good spot, being able to just kind of squeeze it all together. If we take a look at the overlay of the empty room and then the after measurement here, let me go ahead and even change this color so it's a little easier for us to see. So just really was able to pull down a lot of those peaks. All in all, improve some of the low end response, actually increase the extension of the low end.
Mm-hmm.
Which was a nice change there. Smooth this out a bit, and then as we'll see with a lot of these larger peaks, just kind of bring them down. As we improve some things, we definitely see some new things arise in terms of a few dips that weren't necessarily there, like this guy here at 213 or so. But all in all, things have really kind of smoothed out, flattened out quite a bit to where it's a very balanced room, very enjoyable to listen in, and things feel very accurate, tight, and well defined. So it's been pretty fun listening to both reference music and hear songs that I use, and to kind of tune and set up also all the rooms that we work on, but also just being here and working and hearing music. in a lot of ways,
Nice.
and particularly in the low end, in ways that I haven't heard before. So let me jump back.
Can I just point to something real quick?
Yeah,
Just so just so for people watching, that we've got a really high resolution on the y-axis, right? Each of those lines is half a decibel. So the
yeah,
bigger lines are 2 decibels apart, and so this is really zoomed in, yeah. And just so we're aware of that, this looks pretty jagged, but it's because we've just zoomed in so far, you know.
yeah.
And I mean, exactly. So in maybe just real quick, Graham, in terms of our goals that we kind of guesstimated when we set out in the first video,
Yeah.
how close did we get? Where are we at?
Yeah. So we made predictions for 1/3 octave band and then 1/24 octave band.
Right.
Oddly enough, not for 1/12. So 1/3, I was hoping to get it to like plus or minus 3 dB.
Okay.
And at 1/24, I think you said plus or minus 5.
Right. So
And
let's do it.
I checked earlier today, so I know where they're at, but we can
Jump to 1/3. Let's start with the 1/3.
so 1/3 is like plus or minus 3.5,
Nice.
3.75. So pretty
Nice.
close.
Pretty close.
Which is awesome. Not quite where I was hoping to be, but nearly there. And I think we can probably get there with a little more tweaking, hopefully. So we'll see how things go later on down the road. And then at 1/24th, was plus or minus, I can do math, 7.5.
7.5. Yeah.
But I, for the sake of this, went back and really double checked, and you were like, it might be hard because there will be one outlier. And sure enough,
That's right.
we've got the one outlier here right at 122. Because if we ignore that one and kind of take what you were talking about, then we're pretty much right there,
Exactly.
5.5 or so, just a little bit above it. And so, other than this one really sharp dip that we're still dealing with, we're pretty darn close, which is exciting.
And do you want to just go back to the 1/3 smoothing? Just I also wanted to just point out that, and with the final result, and also just by the way, this is obviously just like before. This is just the left speaker.
Correct.
But just notice how balanced it is overall, right? With the empty room, we still have that overall arch, and that's gone, right? And so this is about as flat as you can get it in kind of your typical home studio. Yeah. Going beyond this point really requires quite a bit more effort. And so I just wanted to kind of
a bigger room.
And a bigger room potentially as well, yeah. Or just having much less space available. Your typical kind of sit in between insulation material situation.
Yes.
But I just wanted to point that out because ultimately, right, that's what we're aiming for. Yeah, this is what we call flat. Yeah, flat in acoustics isn't like with electronics. We're not looking at a frequency response like with a converter. This is acoustics, and this is about as flat as it gets. Yeah, that's why I don't really talk about flat. I talk about balanced. Yeah, because what we want is that overall balanced response.
Yeah, I think balance is like the key word in everything with acoustics. We want the decay time to be balanced from the top of the frequency spectrum to the bottom of it. We want the frequency response to be balanced, and we don't, want any big variations really close to one another, because that's what makes it hard to learn your room, or to, if you're, it makes it hard to learn your room. So if you're trying to get your mixes to translate, you're going to struggle. If you're just sitting there listening to things, all of a sudden one note's really going to stick out in the bass. If the room isn't balanced, that doesn't mean ruler flat. It just means not having wild variations, from like 1 octave band to the next, or 1/3 octave band to the next.
Exactly. And maybe talking about the time response, do you want to show us the before and after for the reverb time?
Yeah. So one tricky thing about this space in particular is that this is our demo room and in our offices, but on the wall to the left of me is our shop where we actually make all of our acoustic treatments.
Right.
So some of these measurements I was able to take while none of the saws or the sanders or dust collectors or anything was going on. And then others had some fun background noise in them. But so this is the empty room.
Yep.
Which we saw earlier. So, in the mid range, and that area is kind of all the way up at 1.5 seconds. And then if we go, let's see, after, if I can find that, as you can see, it's there. It's just not on the graph right now. So let me scroll down a little bit. And so this came way down, and we were hoping to get, for a treated room, particularly a room with this much treatment, I would expect that our mid-range high frequencies to be at 200 milliseconds or well below that, as it is in this case. So right now, our initial plans actually still have more scatter faces that need to go on the gobos behind us, some probably additional ones on the side walls. But because they're in here already, we still have some reflections. So while the decay time's super short, it doesn't feel very fatiguing. I've been spending pretty much every day in here working, and haven't had any issues with that. It's just very, very well defined. Everything's super articulate.
Nice.
So despite how short the decay time currently is, particularly in that mid-range, high frequency range, even the low mids, it's very pleasant to be in here, and things are very well defined. Stereo imaging is awesome. And then as expected, we start to see this rise in the low frequency decay time.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is a little bit higher than I was hoping to get it at. We were kind of shooting for this 300 millisecond range here. If we can get it lower than that, all the better, but not too far out of what was expected. Just in terms of like what can really be accomplished with broadband bass trapping and low frequency control. It's hard to get your decay times really well below that, 300 millisecond range, just because there's so much energy in those waveforms, and they want to move around.
Yeah, and I mean the like porous absorption kind of loses its effectiveness going really low down, right? Even with very, very deep panels or very deep broadband porous absorption, it's just not like down into the lowest frequency. It just kind of loses its effectiveness. So if you're trying to go to like 200 or 100 milliseconds down below that, down below 100 hertz, you need to complement that with resonance traps in some shape or form. And we'll talk about that again in a bit. But just moving forward in this, just so we see again or continue on in seeing what the difference is. Shall we have a look at the spectrogram and just see what that looks like? So with kind of the combination of frequency and time.
Yeah.
Exactly. So this is basically what it looks like now. Do you want to just jump to the before version just to give us an impression of where we started off?
Yeah. So this is the empty room.
Right.
Obviously, we looked at this earlier, but we can just see again all of the longer decay times as we move upward on this y-axis here, and then looking at the color variation, we can see some of the more. If I zoom in a bit, a little bit more of that variation in terms of the overall frequency response and how balanced that is. We've got a lot more kind of peak energy showing up in different places, as opposed to the after measurement here, where it's a much more consistent, dispersion of energy both over time and amplitude across the frequency spectrum, which is exactly what we're looking for as we start to treat things. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, where we're really just trying to balance things out, make them as smooth as possible, as well balanced as possible, so that we can really hear the speakers and not the room.
Yeah, it looks great. I mean, really great results. This is about as good as it gets with working with porous absorption. Finally, maybe just an impulse response, quick move through the impulse response, just to see the same result again shown in a different way, a different view on the same data.
Yeah. So again, we've got the empty room here. So kind of what we'd be looking at right now is the Schroeder line showing a lot of reflected energy, as we saw in the spectrogram, and then some of the more prominent peaks in reflected energy here over time at the bottom. And then if we jump to the treated version of the room, we'll see obviously our decay time comes down massively. So we have a lot more clarity, a lot more definition in things. There are a couple reflections left that we can see now, and very prominently so, because at this stage there's really only 3 real reflections that are kind of poking their head out and saying, hey, maybe try to deal with me. I don't know that there's much at this stage that we can really do about it. We've got treatment in most places. We've tried treatment on the floor and everything else, as we'll see as we start going through all of the different measurements and kind of experimentations that we tried in the room. But things are looking really good. It's we want to see this kind of smoothly decay over time. And other than at 12 milliseconds and 11, and then this short guy here at just under 3, this is a very nice, smooth looking impulse response.
Yeah, sweet. Well, great, amazing. So maybe let's take it in steps. So starting at the empty room, and we're just going to focus on the frequency response and the spectrogram, because those are kind of the easiest to follow along with. So walk us through the different steps of the treatment and how things changed.
For sure. So here we've got the empty room as we started. This did actually have the not even 2x4 foot bass trap panel in the front soffit, because I forgot to take a measurement of the empty room, but one tiny panel, and that's about it. And so a great representation of what the room is like without treatment. And then from there, we worked our way around the room, starting with the ceiling wall corner. So all those, what I've got labeled as soffit traps in here. And so our next measurement is going to show the front soffit as well as the left and right ones. And so as we go through this, really, as we'd kind of expect to see, there's no major variations yet, just really kind of an overall smoothing of some of the peaks. And let me actually hop over to the overlays for this part, and then we'll jump to the spectrogram.
Cool.
In a second, because I think this will give a better representation of what's happening and what's changing, so we can kind of go through one at a time. But yeah, as we've treated at this stage, really just a few corners in the room, we can already start to see some of these larger peaks really smooth out. Not a massive change to the overall shape of the room, particularly from 200 hertz and below yet, but already seeing some big changes all the way down to 99 or so and 73, where things are just getting smoother. And that's kind of how it will progress for a while. So now this has the front, back, left, and right soffit traps. So these are all of the wall, ceiling, corner traps that we put in the room. And, as a couple more were added, primarily just on that back wall now, we see a much larger change in the low end. So really quite a bit being accomplished just from treating those corners. And in a room, if it's a smaller room, taking this principle and applying it to a room where maybe you don't have a lot of space for bass traps on the side walls or on the front or the back wall, this can be a great way, because it's space that you're never going to use. It's pretty much all the way up on the ceiling, very similarly kind of how you have your ceiling treated in there. So it doesn't affect the overall kind of layout or floor plan of your room, but can still accomplish quite a bit.
Yeah.
Let me just real quickly, while we're here, jump to that spectrogram.
Okay.
Show that progression. So again, empty room, corner traps on the left, right, and front wall. So immediately seeing this decay time come down quite a bit, quite massively. So really quickly, just because as soon as you start putting panels in a room, things will change pretty quickly. It's once you really start to get panels everywhere that it's harder to make bigger incremental changes. Then we're looking for things to change, 1, 2 dB at a time, and won't see nearly as much of a change. But right now, each panel makes a pretty significant difference. And so from empty room to all of those soffit traps, we've got quite a big improvement there. And then let's see what happens when we start installing some more panels.
And interesting enough, right, this in terms of frequency response, the difference isn't huge. So you wouldn't expect it to sound that much different if you were just looking at the frequency response. And that's one of the major mistakes that people make, right, is just focusing so heavily on this one aspect, this one view on the overall sound, when the room actually probably sounds quite different with just those soffit traps in place.
Yeah. So super, super important to be looking at the time domain, because that's where things will change the most, and also has the biggest impact on what we hear. And then jumping back to the frequency response before we take a look at the additional treatment, is that all of these larger changes that we've seen so far, these are room modes. that are being smoothed out currently. So all 3 or 4 of these peaks that we're seeing here coincide with the room modes that we were able to calculate using the room mode calculator back in video 1, and really starting to make some big improvements there. Now, things got a little interesting here, as we'll see. Yeah. So this was the introduction of the big corner traps. So 8 foot by 4 foot corner traps in the front, on the front side walls, straddling those corners, and just a lot of changes overall. Let me zoom in a bit on our low end now, so we can kind of target what's actually happening here. Because this was pretty interesting, a little surprising. So some things, you know, we got a lot of this range here, the 60 hertz or so back, because this was pulled down. But then all of a sudden, everything above it started to kind of disappear. And as we'll see, and as we progress, a lot of times as you're treating a room, and this is why it's hard to predict exactly what's happening or what is the source of one problem, is all of these things are interacting. So if we jump back to the spectrogram measurement, we see a big improvement timing wise now. You know, all of a sudden our low end decay time has really smoothed out immensely. This is a much more, this is without those front corner traps. And then with them, we have a much more balanced response. But from a frequency response, things have changed, probably not so much for the better currently. And that's just sort of part of treating. Yes, part of treating the room. It's hard to say exactly what this one problem is, unfortunately. But as we'll see, things just shift. We fix some problems, and then we uncover new problems that we couldn't see before because everything's interacting. So we've got front reflections off of all the surfaces that are interacting with one another. We've got speaker boundary interference that's affecting the speaker versus what's arriving at the microphone, and how all those things interact. And so that was kind of one of the more fun parts of this process. And also one of the harder parts was really trying to pinpoint exactly what is happening and how do we get things to where we want them. But we'll see a lot change.
This can be really frustrating when you're only doing this once with your own room, right?
Yeah.
Because it seems so random, right? And the way I like to describe it is just like you're kind of peeling away the layers of a rotten onion, right? So there are all these layers stacked on top of each other. And so the top layers are actually masking potentially some kind of rotten layers underneath, right? So as you start removing those, some rotten layer might pop out and actually give you this. And until you then remove this new layer, aka this particular issue that is causing this, you won't get back to a more balanced response, right? So my kind of initial impression is that what probably happened here is that removing or damping some of those room modes quite heavily then revealed the effect of speaker boundary interference and potentially a floor reflection, maybe a sidewall reflection, and so the room modes. That's why we kind of want to tackle room modes first. They have the strongest impact. Yeah, that's why we focus on the listening position mainly on room modes. They have the strongest impact in this whole game of removing issues. Room modes are the strongest player, and once you start damping those, all the other issues that aren't as strong start appearing, and actually potentially wreaking havoc. And so that's what's probably happening here. And then let's see what happens as you continue on.
Yeah. So then we put in the clouds, which are again bass trap panels, pretty much covering the entire ceiling in here. And so another very big change. So we gained back some of the hole that we just created, but then now have 2 narrower dips kind of on either side of it. And some other things happening higher up. So these are, I believe, cancellations probably that we can start to see now that we have a lot of the surfaces treated. The back wall's still completely untreated at this stage. The side walls are completely untreated. So we're starting to see some of those reflections in the problems that those are introducing because we've removed a lot of those other problems. So this highlighted one now is all of the corner traps, the clouds, and the back wall. So from our previous measurement, without the back wall treated. We've got a bit of smoothing here, but not a whole lot else has really changed. That's kind of the one big improvement. This knoll starting to fill in. Nothing too crazy at this stage, but getting back some of that information we've lost, but definitely still have some issues to deal with here. And so then that brought in the sidewall panels, and that just kind of further changed things. A little bit smoother because the knolls aren't as deep, but this is a very wide hole.
Although it's overall, just reminding everybody that we're looking at a very high resolution in the vertical scale. Yeah, so we're only looking at like, what is that, 6 or 8 decibels maybe on average.
Yeah, so like this is only, it's a lot, but it is about 5-6 dB below where we'd like it to be.
Yeah.
So we're not talking about like a
25 decibel
20
dip.
dB loss. It's not that you don't hear that information. It's just pulled back quite a bit.
Exactly,
from 60 hertz where we're hearing that, and from right above that where we've got a bit of a peak at 180. So there's not quite the balance that we're looking for. It's not by any means that it's not being heard in the room. It's just not as balanced as we would like it.
Yeah.
And so this is to the point where the kind of initial treatment was planned. The design that we covered in video 2, this is where that sort of left off, and certainly at this stage leaves some things to be desired. So that started the process then of diving into what's going on in the room, trying to pinpoint what's leading to these problems, and how we can correct it and get a better frequency response, create a more balanced room, all of the things that we've kind of been discussing. If we take a look at just the spectrogram at this stage, we're seeing the same trends here we were talking about earlier, just from, I'm going backwards, but each one of these is getting longer and longer in decay time. And now, again, progressing through the treatment stages, things are certainly improving. The room's getting better and better sounding. It's just losing some energy here. So we've got a nice even decay time, some issues in the low end that we'd like to bring into control a little bit further. But all in all, it's looking pretty good. It's just got this massive hole in it. And so to start with, it was just sort of like, okay, what else can be done? And there were some pretty simple things to start with, was just putting fluffy insulation behind the big corner traps to see if that would help improve anything. And this is typically what happens. If you take a big bass trap and you straddle a corner, or if we're building out, 2 foot deep or even deeper bass traps, we'll use multiple layers of different types and different densities of insulation, because you get a smoother, better impact in the really, really low information that way. I did exaggerate a couple of these dips, interestingly enough, which is just, I think, a matter of having better corner treatment, or more effective, which means these 2 areas that aren't necessarily related to the corner have even more freedom to kind of wreak havoc on the room there.
It is only 2 decibels. Again, reminding everybody that the difference in those low dips from not having the pink fluffy and having it in there, it's 2 decibels. Yeah, so who knows what that is down to.
Yeah, and then so this is without the fluffy insulation, and then with it. So we can see on the spectrogram in particular, at this, this is 50 hertz or so, quite a big improvement from our decay time in the really, really low frequencies. So that's an area where it's very effective. It's a very easy thing to add to treatment in your room, and just to get a little bit more performance in that sub range, which is can be a challenging thing to find in a lot of areas. Challenging to find that performance and benefit in a lot of ways with other treatments. So from there, we started experimenting a little bit more, because that obviously did not fix the massive hole that we've got here. So the gobos on the back wall were about 6 inches away from the back wall. And so the next thing that I tried was just pulling those up off that back wall to increase the air gap, essentially, that we had between the back wall and the gobos themselves.
And also, so in a way, kind of cover up some of the last remaining flat surfaces, right?
Covers up. Yeah. So now there's no, at least they're there behind the gobos, but there were the doors that weren't treated yet. So some parallel surfaces in the back of the room that weren't treated. It also puts the gobos just more in front of the corners as opposed to flat on the back wall. And so if we pull this in, this did start to change things a little bit here. Made some things better, as we'll kind of find is a pretty common thread here. We make a little bit of an improvement, and then we also, might either uncover some new problems or just make things a little bit worse. But as a whole, this looked pretty promising for both the low end side of things, and some of what we're experiencing in this hole here. And so pulling those up did improve the real low end side of things quite a bit from 100 hertz and below, starting to make a little bit of an improvement there and kind of, get every ounce of performance out of the room that we can. That's ultimately what we're looking for. And while not everybody may be able to put gobos 2-3 feet off the wall from an acoustics standpoint and, looking at the best practices and principles, that's very much so what you would ideally do, is have a back wall treated, have your back wall treated with 2 feet of bass trapping, 3 feet of bass trapping. If you're looking at big studios, that's how they're built out. Those treatments are not thin, because the deeper they are, the better they're going to work. So it's no surprise there. It's just sort of not necessarily where, from a practical standpoint, would be the most ideal place to put them. And so from there, I put some panels on the floor, trying to see, what of this whole region here that we're working with and dealing with and trying to fill back in, where is it coming from? And so with the floor treated, we can see we get a lot of like 90 hertz back. And we also start to fill in some stuff above it. We smooth out this peak here. So it's very interesting. Things change quite drastically from treating one surface to another, but no individual piece is able to really fill back in that whole void. And what we're seeing is that that null
of things
is a combination of multiple surfaces.
It's so wide, obviously, right?
So why it's so wide, yes. Any individual surface would be a much narrower thing. It's also why it's so hard to predict exactly what to treat, or to say this is going to be your problem in that room, because in smaller rooms that don't have treatment that is, multiple feet deep on every surface, all of these things are interacting. And so as we uncover them or treat them in one area, we're uncovering the problems in another area. And ultimately our goal is to find the best combination of things that provides the most balanced room response.
Can you just remind me what, when you say you treated the floor, what does that actually involve in practice?
This measurement had basically a 12-inch deep panel on the floor. There's a 6x4 foot bass trap panel that I then put 2 3x4 foot panels on top of. So, and they were directly underneath the speaker and then moved out into the room up towards the microphone. So really covering as much of the area underneath the speaker and in between the speaker and the microphone as possible.
Okay, gotcha.
Trying to eliminate any possible SBIR off the floor or just reflections, floor bounce off the floor, that's arriving back to the microphone as well. From there, we moved that 6x4 foot panel, took everything off the floor, put the 6x4 foot bass trap panel on the front wall. So blocking that window that's in front of the desk.
Because that at this point was kind of partially treated, but for the sake of having more light, I guess.
The whole middle section of the room is pretty much untreated. So the middle section of the front wall. I really just left it there because the window was there. From an ideal standpoint, not having soffit mounted speakers or flush mounted speakers, you'd want the whole wall treated, but thought maybe that was something we could get away with not having, or something that we would add in later. And as we'll see, it certainly ended up being a necessary component of treating the space. One other thing to note, these measurements stop at 2K. I was taking pretty much, probably 100 plus measurements or so, and I didn't want to hear 20,000 hertz all the time. And I was, we're really looking at this range here. not that range, but the 600 hertz and down, basically 20 to 500 hertz, that stuff, that information where we're looking for these big changes in the null that we're working with. So just kind of focus those measurements, because not at this stage super concerned with anything in the high frequencies.
Exactly. Yeah.
So treating this is the floor highlighted here, and then the front wall. And this was kind of revealing because there wasn't really as much of a change as I was expecting to see. I thought the floor was going to be contributing more to our problems, and while it's certainly a factor in what's going on, it wasn't, at least what I would have hoped maybe have been the main cause of most of what we were experiencing.
Yeah.
So from there, I tried treating a combination of both the front wall and the floor. So now each of those surfaces have 6 inches of absorption on them. Basically the same layout we talked about before. And this introduced a pretty interesting change here.
Yeah.
So with both surfaces treated, we see quite a bit of improvement in filling the hole that we had, because just to remind everybody, this is kind of where we started in terms of this hole here that we're trying to fill.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then from here, so we filled it in a lot of that actual hole. This null here seems to have shifted down, and this is the most interesting kind of change that we'll see really at any stage now where the floor is treated in addition to these other surfaces. Haven't been able to pinpoint exactly why. It's just like that combination of treating the floor and the front wall leads to this big shift at 190 or so. We can certainly get rid of it by not treating the floor, but the combination of things always seems to present this as a new problem. But ultimately, we are seeing some ways that we can improve this. So heading in the right direction, at least. Between our initial panels on the sidewall, so those initial bass trap panels that are spaced off the wall 6 inches, and our corner traps, there is a tiny, maybe 4-inch wide, if that, gap between the two where there's a little bit of wall exposed. So happens that also is basically directly across from the speakers. So there is a little bit of untreated space there.
It's the wall section basically right next to the speakers.
Exactly. So to see if that was contributing to what was going on, I took, it's just what we had laying around here. So 3 2-inch deep panels that we placed on each side directly in front of our sidewall panels, but pushed all the way up towards those front corners. And that is what we got here from this measurement. So not a ton of change from when we had the floor treated, although we do have a bit of smoothing here, which is very beneficial. And then even more energy introduced back around 100 hertz or so. And we've made this null a little bit shallower. So some good things happening, but with the floor treated, the front and the sides, we've still got this massive hole here at 190. But a very different shape overall from kind of where we started.
Yeah.
And so the next step I took was just getting rid of the floor treatment. And so to compare those, this is blue is with the floor treated, and then orange is without the floor treated. And this is ultimately pretty much what we landed on. And it was kind of interesting because as we removed the floor, we were able to further reduce or, bring more energy back into this null that we were seeing here at 65 hertz, smooth out the peak at 105. And obviously the floor is very much so contributing to this 180, 190 range kind of changes depending on what the treatment is in there. So there's some stuff going on there, but overall, this was the most balanced combination of those new treatments that we could really find. And then to show the full range version of it, here it is with the desk. Let me make sure we got the same smoothing on all of these. Yeah, so this is with the desk. Really, as a whole, the most balanced combination of things that we could find up to this stage, at least. We've got some ideas on things that we'll approach in video 4, but all in all, really was quite happy with the change that we were able to make here in terms of working towards filling in the pretty massive hole that we had after we'd finished sort of the initial stages of the treatment.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. But thanks, first of all, Graham, again, for making that effort of going through all those steps and taking those measurements, and then now obviously walking us through it. How it's very interesting. It's so revealing, and we don't get to see that very often. Takeaways. What are we learning? What have we learned from this?
Totally. So there was one other thing that we did in this process, which was we took out the front corners.
Right.
And then I tried a couple of different speaker placements, just kind of quickly going through that, because the corners, if you remember, were where this big initial null was first introduced. And so I was curious if taking out the corners was going to result in maybe fixing some of these issues. As we can see here, it most definitely did not. So it's not the corner traps in and of themselves that are creating that problem. And below that, this is exactly what you'd expect to see as you remove the big corners. Dealing with a lot of our low end energy, we have big peaks then coming back.
This looks to me like there's some sort of comb filter getting created, right? We've got that big dip, which is now somewhere at like 75 hertz, and then everything below that is actually pushed up. Yeah. So
right.
So this looks to me like some sort of comb filter messing with the low end there.
The other interesting takeaway.
So you basically tried messing with the speaker positions at this point, seeing what can we actually do with just speaker positioning, right?
Exactly. So then it was a matter of, and this has a lot of basically all of the treatment in here except for those corners still.
Yeah, the front corner traps. Yeah.
And so there's a lot going on here, but was a just curiosity to see, are the corner traps creating a problem to where we can't get the speakers into the most ideal position now that the room is treated? And so I was able to place the speakers in a way where we could get rid of some of these problems. So SP4 is where the speakers currently are. That was the best speaker location from the initial listening test that we did in video 1 when the room was empty. Here I could fix this problem, but I couldn't fix a lot of the other problems. Primarily then I tried, we don't have the measurement in here, but we put smaller corner traps in the corners in treatment further up than on the sidewalls. And as soon as that happened, we saw a lot more of the same shapes being introduced back in here. And none of the real impact that we needed from 60 hertz and below to smooth this out. So we weren't getting the same decay time control, and we weren't getting the same balance from our sub frequency information. So while this was fixed, at least at this stage, it didn't really present the opportunity to treat the rest of the room as well as I wanted.
And this is basically moving the speakers sort of back up against the front wall on their kind of equilateral triangle axes. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah, as close to the front wall as I could get it, basically.
Yeah. So this shows us kind of that effect, right? The effect that everybody talks about when improving speaker boundary interference effects by moving the speakers up against the wall. This is it in action.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you want to get rid of this 150 hertz peak or null, you can move your speaker closer to the wall, and that is this is most likely our front wall SBIR, but in that we can see it moving up. Oh, sorry, this is not it moving up. Wrong measurement. Been looking at too many things, but yeah. So you can see that in action. But that's just a matter of like we're looking for an overall balance, and while it fixed that one thing here, as I took further measurements and tests, it just didn't ultimately result in a better overall room response. And then this was just a third speaker placement, a little bit kind of in between the speaker being all the way up on the front wall and where it is now. And so we can see pretty much the same shape starting to come back into play, just not quite as deep or at least as prominent here in this null. But ultimately what found and kind of revealed was that the listening test that we did in terms of finding the best speaker location and the best listening position, those things didn't change. And I think that's such a valuable thing for people to know, because there ultimately is really nothing more helpful or more impactful than getting the speaker placement right in a room and getting the listening position right in a room. And those two things interacting will have a huge impact on whether your room fully treated or whether the room's empty, and how balanced things can be.
Yeah.
And so it's so crucial to get those right. And it was really cool to see that pretty much no matter what we did, the test that we did, we took measurements, but the placement of both the listening position and the speaker placement ultimately were kind of decided from the listening test.
Yeah.
And so this is something that anybody can do, at home, in their studio, in their listening room, whatever it may be, to really to get things off on the right foot and give themselves the best opportunity to have a room that sounds really great.
Yeah. And it's fantastic that you can pull that lever right from the beginning, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't cost you anything. You can start with that, and that pretty much that's what it's going to end up like. Yeah. You might be moving things around an inch here or there, but that's a bit about it. Yeah. And the fact that you can get such a reliable, or that there's such a reliable way to find that ideal listening position and speaker position from the start is great, isn't it?
Yeah.
But so quick tangent there into the speaker positioning takeaway. But overall, what are we taking away from this in terms of treating a room?
Yeah, I think overall it's kind of the things that we've talked about throughout most of this video and the previous two videos, is that, like, one, we're really shooting for balance. And so targeting the things that are going to make the room as even and balanced sounding as possible, countering that, while the frequency response is important, keeping in mind that we really do care about the decay time, that has a huge impact on how we hear things, our ability to understand the relation of low end information within a mix or within a song. And that knowing that as we change one thing, we're probably going to see something else change in a way that we may not hope for. And just really taking that process through to fruition can be a little bit challenging and daunting at times, but using measurements and using treatments to experiment with and play around in your room will ultimately lead to a space that can be very well balanced. And I think just knowing that, like, the best practices ultimately will lead, to the kind of best case scenario. So it's like, obviously there should be no surprise to us that having the front wall treated in this room and having those gobos pulled up off the back wall, we're able to fix a lot of the initial problems that we saw in the design that I first put together. Because all we really changed was adding a couple panels and putting what was already in the design in a better place to work at low frequencies. And so I think the overall approach works really well. It's just making sure that everything's implemented in a way that allows it to work to its fullest potential. So utilizing air gaps, making sure the speakers in the listening position are in the right place, and taking those best practices and really implementing them into the room as well as we can, while still making it a space that functionally works. Yeah.
Amazing. And the fact that acoustics is very much an iterative process, right? Unless you're building from scratch and you can plan everything ahead of time, you can make an initial estimation based on first principles, and that will get you pretty far. And then from there on out, it's about experimenting, and
totally.
And making gradual improvements and understanding that it is one big system. It's not one change to like a panel placement won't fix everything. That's not how it works, right? It's gradual improvements, many little steps in the right direction, and the more you can take of those steps, the better it's going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. The other, I think, takeaway and thing that's probably important to note, for anybody who's watching this or is trying to use measurements in their room, is we can go through, if I start where, like, at all corners and we look at our impulse responses, and I kind of quickly go through these things change quite a bit as we introduce new treatments. And the impulse response is really powerful in terms of understanding where some of these problems might lie. But it also, as we see these combinations of things happening, doesn't mean you can look at like a single measurement and say, this is my one problem. I know you and I both have calculators that kind of can help us figure out what SBIR is, where the SBIR problems or where are our floor bouncer early reflection problems happening. But because those things are always compounding on top of each other, the math can be right, but what we actually see take shape in the measurements doesn't necessarily translate or correlate to the math.
Yeah.
Um, and
Sometimes it
so
does. And then you're just like,
sometimes it
sweet.
does, and it's great. Yes, absolutely. It does. I find it actually does so oddly more so in like less well treated rooms where
Yeah.
you can see the really prominent things happening. And it's like, clearly this is what's going on. But using measurements as a comparative tool, we talked about this, I think, before in one of
Yeah.
the other videos, but you know, it is so helpful as we've kind of walked through it and been able to see, okay, are things getting better? Is the time domain improving? Is the overall balance of our frequency response improving? It's very hard to look at a set of measurements and say, okay, you need to treat this, you need to treat this, and you need to treat this. It's
Yeah.
not necessarily something that puts together the game plan for you. It's something that really aids in you, is a helpful tool and aids in determining whether or not you're taking the right steps, or maybe things need to move and try a different approach or a different combination of things.
Yeah. Yeah. Should we have a quick look at the desk measurements, maybe?
Yeah.
Just to kind of breeze over that, because it's fun. Because I don't know, anybody watching this, maybe you've seen that Graham has an amazing DIY desk that is basically slotted. And this conversation about different desks and removing the desk reflection comes up a lot. And Graham's own version of trying to do that is quite interesting. So for anybody who's seen that, let's have a quick look at what the desk does or doesn't do in your particular case.
Yeah. So we can show some pictures of it, but it is just it's basically a slotted desk. So it's a bunch of slats of plywood that I put together. It also holds some rack gear. So I've got like my converters in it, my monitor controller, and a power supply. And the goal was just to make a desk that didn't contribute to, major desk reflections or issues that one you'd see in measurements, but ultimately just things that you would hear. So, typically, depending on the size of the desk, you can see some pretty wild variations in things anywhere from all the way down to 500 hertz up to 3K or so. And so this is without a desk in the room currently. And then let's see here. This is with the desk. So normally, if you took a with and without the desk measurement, you'd see some pretty massive changes in this range, where it's like all of a sudden here's a big drop, or you put a panel on top of the desk and all of a sudden like things smooth out a ton. We really don't see that here at all. So fortunately, it's worked pretty well. It was very much so just an experiment. I was kind of curious one day and built the desk. And ultimately it does work really quite well, which has been fun, because it's best case scenario is either you just don't have a desk, or you have a desk that's acoustically invisible or transparent, and it for the most part accomplishes that quite well, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's amazing. I just wanted to show that off. So it is possible to build a slotted desk and get rid of the desk reflection.
Maybe we'll put plans together for it.
I'm sure if you guys want that, let Graham know. I'm sure he can make something happen. Yeah, and maybe to round this off, what further potential improvements could we still make? Is that anything that comes to mind right away? Anything that you still want to try from now and between now and the next video?
Yeah, definitely. So I think first and foremost, just seeing what we can do to improve potentially the low and decay time of the room. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, I think, but if I scroll through some of our decay time measurements here, our shop, one, is where we make everything, but two, has a train directly behind it, a concrete company next to it. And so a lot of these treated rooms, we'll see like our low frequency decay time changes quite a bit, just depending on like when I took the measurement. So this is kind of our best performance right now, and probably the most indicative of what's actually happening, or the most representative of what's going on in the room. It's just hard to capture because there's always so much stuff that generates a lot of low frequency noise around us. It can be true in any studio, if you have your air conditioning on, or if a truck drives by. In rooms that aren't really well isolated, this is the thing that's hardest to find or really read and analyze in a measurement, because it varies so much. But
maybe you can just jump to the waterfall real quick, because I thought it was really interesting and obvious there between some of the measurements. If you go full width, full spectrum, and we can see some of those non-acoustic resonance issues come in. Yeah, so there's one there, and you can tell that it's not an acoustic issue, or it's not a room response issue because it's kind of flat. It just kind of,
you can also
yeah, go ahead.
you can see it really well on the spectrogram because it just continues.
It's just a line. Yeah,
it doesn't stop.
On. It doesn't stop.
Yeah. So there's a few things happening depending on like what we have going on in the shop that makes some of these things challenging. But ultimately, knowing that our decay time,
this one's pretty good.
At the low end.
Let's find one which is really bad. Go on and to see if we can find one that's really bad. That one's pretty decent too. But yeah, what is that?
We've got
Who knows?
some new things happening here. So don't build your studio next to a super noisy shop would be my advice. But knowing that our decay time sits, around 350, somewhere in that range or so, 370, trying to bring this down from 80 hertz or so down to 40. So we're going to build a couple membrane traps, or probably a few membrane traps. Try bringing those in here, seeing if we can get that controlled a little bit more. I don't have these measurements in here, but out of curiosity, took a few measurements, like with the mic up against the back wall, one, so we could make sure that we got the tuning right for the membrane traps, but also just to see what was going on with, the frequency response all the way in the back of the room. And so there's one area where, if I go to like where we're currently at, there's a lot of 60. This was something that piqued my curiosity, is this little bit of a null here that we got at 62 hertz. There's a lot of that energy at the back wall.
Okay.
And so if we can potentially control some of that, it will be interesting to see if we can resolve any of this and smooth it out a bit potentially. Don't know whether or not that will work yet, but hopefully that will help a little bit. So main goal is to smooth out the really low information here as much as possible, a little bit further, and then also balance out the decay time a bit more. But beyond that, pretty thrilled with the room so far.
Yeah. What does it sound like now, Graham? You gave an initial impression in the last video, but yeah, what does it sound like now?
Yeah, so now I've had some time to actually sit in here and listen, spend a good bit of time working, and it sounds incredible. It's the there's not a lot of untreated surfaces, and so it's not there's not a lot of time that I've been able to spend in rooms that were treated this thoroughly, or even just work on rooms that were treated this thoroughly. And that even goes back to when I was making records in bigger studios and that kind of thing. It's just commercial studios. So the definition and the clarity, the stereo imaging, everything's just incredibly accurate and detailed. The low end so far, despite not being perfectly flat, is incredibly smooth. I don't hear any big resonances sticking out, any notes that are just kind of overpowering in the low end, which is exactly what I want to hear, as I'm listening to stuff. I want it to feel smooth, articulate, well-defined, and to get a really good sense of the relation of the kick drum and the bass drum and any of the lower frequency information that's in the synths or the electric guitars and that stuff. So it's been a really fun room to listen in. It's got
excellent.
Super wide stereo image, which I like. I think stereo placement's kind of a little bit of a preference thing. And I have ATCs in here, which have a very wide dispersion pattern, particularly left to right. So the monitors are pretty wide, or the tweeters are pretty far apart, but everything's very well balanced. The vocals are incredibly present, right in the middle. So it's a quite, I don't have any bad things to say about it so far. It sounds phenomenal. It's just more so of can we really make the room even any better? Because it's an incredibly enjoyable room to listen in. It feels quite immersive, but is also just incredibly well defined and accurate, and has a lot of clarity to it. So it's been a lot of fun to listen so far in there.
Amazing, good job.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a fun process so far.
I'm sure. Well, maybe let's wrap it up there for now. I think that we went through enough mind bending mind-blowing, brain smoking. What's the word? How do you say it? Making your brain smoke.
Mind blowing. Oh,
Mind-blowing, yeah, but
yeah, mind
just
blowing.
intense stuff. So maybe let's just wrap it up there.
Yeah.
So thanks again for everybody watching. So this next video, the fourth one in the series, is gonna be us testing the resonance traps. So be on the lookout for that. That's once again gonna be on Graham's Music City Acoustic channel. So check that out and subscribe to it if you haven't already. And then if you have any questions, hit us up. Probably the best space is the comments as usual, and we'll do a little Q&A round to wrap up the next video, going through your questions, going through your comments, yeah. Graham, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you.
And see you next time.
All right. Cheers. See ya.
See ya.